But first, hit like and subscribe to fuel our growing community. This vast continent boasts some of the planet's most breathtaking scenery, stretching from rugged ocean coastlines to towering alpine peaks and expansive sandy deserts. Across this immense land, from shore to shore and everywhere in between, countless nations and tribes made their homes. This was their ancestral land. Then newcomers arrived by sea, forever altering the landscape of power. In the spring of 1803, two American diplomats in Paris sealed what would become the most advantageous real estate deal in history. With a mere signature, the United States doubled its territory for just $15 million. Yet, this Louisiana purchase wasn't a straightforward land sale from France, because France didn't truly own the territory. What the U.S. acquired were imperial rights. France agreed to step aside and allow the young nation to colonize the vast expanse without interference. But true ownership required negotiation with the original inhabitants, the many Native American tribes who had lived there for millennia. These indigenous peoples had been on this land long before Europeans dreamed of crossing the Atlantic, and this land was theirs. This isn't just a modern perspective. At the time, the U.S. recognized that it would have to purchase the land from its rightful owners. The plan was to do things differently than the old imperial powers. George Washington himself declared the government's Indian affairs must be governed by justice and humanity. So, instead of conquest, the U.S. aimed to negotiate treaties and pay fairly for the land. After all, this was a nation founded on ideals of justice, peace, and liberty. Our series, How the U.S. Stole, traces America's rise from colonial settlers to global superpower. But none of that would be possible without this foundational story, the first land the U.S. ever took. As European settlers flooded into the new nation, the government made treaties with tribes to allow settlement. Initially, this was a peaceful exchange. Food, tools, cash, and services were offered in return for land rights. But many tribes refused to leave their ancestral homes for farming equipment. Here, Washington's ideals began to erode. The growing nation needed more land for its expanding population, and settlers and officials started to use underhanded tactics. The westward push was unstoppable. When tribes resisted, conflict followed. Near the Great Lakes, one group refused to sell land and drew a boundary at a river, warning the U.S. to stay out. The U.S. rejected this and went to war, losing twice. On the third attempt, they won and forced a treaty ceding much of present-day Ohio. Similar events unfolded in the Southeast. The Seminole tribes resisted removal, leading to war, deaths, and forced relocation to inhospitable swamps. In Alabama, the Muskogee Nation initially sold part of their land in exchange for keeping the rest, and the U.S. agreed. But 4 years later, white settlers encroached, pushing the Muskogee out. When tensions flared, the military forcibly removed them without a new treaty. Deceptive tactics were common. Tribal leaders were sometimes tricked into signing away land while intoxicated, or imposters were appointed to sign treaties on behalf of entire tribes. In another case, the Sioux and Arapaho repeatedly defeated U.S. forces and secured a peace treaty, until gold was found on their land 8 years later. The U.S. violated the treaty, redrew boundaries, built roads, and miners flooded the territory. Treaties and justice were ignored. Eventually, many tribes realized resistance meant violence, so they signed treaties, took the payments, and left. Over nearly a century, the U.S. signed 368 treaties with tribes, systematically displacing them to make way for white settlers who claimed the land their government had taken. All the paperwork in treaties created a veneer of legality, but it was a thin mask for imperial conquest. Before we continue, a quick note. This video has no sponsor. Some sponsors find our content too political, which is disappointing because we strive to tell compelling stories. Thankfully, you can support us on any how you can by starting from following our page, clicking on like button, sharing our work to your friends to see it, and watch. Now, back to the story. Despite all the fake treaties and deals, one region in the Deep South proved especially resistant to this forced removal campaign. And that struggle would shape the future in ways few expected. What do you think about these early U.S. policies toward Native American lands? How do you see this history reflected in current events? If this story moved you, please like, comment, subscribe, and share to help spread awareness. Your voice matters. Let's keep this conversation going. For a long time, 5 major Native American nations lived alongside settlers, each having signed treaties with the United States that recognized their rights to their ancestral lands. Many among them spoke English, practiced farming, and adopted European-style clothing. Some even owned slaves. Because of these adaptations, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee, and Seminole became known as the 5 civilized tribes. There exists an alternative history where these tribes might have continued living peacefully alongside European settlers. But that vision was shattered largely due to cotton. Southern farmers were growing wealthy from cotton, a lucrative cash crop sold worldwide to textile mills. This booming industry depended heavily on the unpaid labor of enslaved Africans. A particularly fertile area called the Black Belt Prairie was ideal for cotton cultivation, but was legally recognized as native land under U.S. treaties. Yet Southern slaveholders eyed this land as perfect for expanding their cotton empire. These planters, backed by state governments, began rewriting the rules. Georgia, especially aggressive, sought to clear native peoples from their land, with its governor openly declaring a goal to replace all of the red with white population. They targeted the Cherokee Nation, passing laws that dismantled their governments. The Cherokee resisted by taking their case to the U.S. legal system, ultimately winning a Supreme Court ruling affirming their sovereign rights. However, judicial decisions only hold power if enforced, and President Andrew Jackson, infamous for his brutal campaigns against Native Americans and featured on the $20 bill, refused to uphold the court's ruling. Jackson mockingly told Chief Justice John Marshall to enforce his own decision, then pushed through the Indian Removal Act of 1830. This law used public funds to forcibly relocate tribes to inhospitable lands west of the Mississippi, promising they would never be disturbed again. The government insisted removals would be voluntary and fair, with treaties negotiated peacefully and existing agreements honored. But this was a facade. Jackson ignored these promises and continued the forced displacement. More treaties were forged under pressure, often signed by unauthorized leaders or obtained through deceit. The government's goal was clear: remove the 5 civilized tribes from their fertile lands to make way for cotton plantations. Between 1831 and 1838, nearly all members of these tribes were expelled, forced to march over 1,000 miles through harsh conditions to unfamiliar territory. The Cherokee called this journey the Trail of Tears, marked by immense suffering and loss. Some resisted, others were captured and marched at gunpoint. Their lands emptied, cotton farmers and enslaved laborers moved in, fueling economic growth built on stolen land and broken promises. Though estimates vary, thousands died during this brutal process. The systematic ethnic cleansing was documented in treaties, payments, and government records, a grim bureaucracy of dispossession. Ironically, the United States, founded on ideals of justice and liberty, enacted the first state-sponsored ethnic cleansing in its history. This dark chapter even influenced future atrocities. Hitler later referenced America's removal policies as a model for his own genocidal plans. Yet the story of the 5 civilized tribes did not end there. Their resilience and ongoing struggle for sovereignty continue to shape American history. How do you interpret the legacy of the 5 civilized tribes and their forced removal? What lessons can we draw from this history about justice and power today? If this story resonates with you, please like, comment, subscribe, and share to keep these important conversations alive. Actually, this is just the beginning. We're planning a second part to this story where I'll reveal what happens after these tribes arrive at their small allocated area on the map, Indian Territory. This is where they were forced to relocate, essentially dumped, and had to start over. I'll also explore how they once again used the very legal systems that had displaced them to push back, and how all of this shaped the creation of a state that might have looked very different today. Thanks so much for watching this video. Most importantly, we'll keep creating content you love. Before you go, what part of this story surprised you the most? How do you think history might have changed if these tribes had been allowed to stay? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and share to help this conversation grow.